Hi everyone, this is William with the Life on the Magic Mountain video series about Thomas Mann's famous novel, The Magic Mountain, and what life was really like in a Davos tuberculosis sanatorium during the period covered by the novel, and also later for the remainder of the sanatorium era. So I took a week-long break from this series. I was a little discouraged. The last installment only got one view, so it's hard to keep going under those circumstances. It does require a fair amount of preparation, but what the heck? I don't want to. The alternative would be to wait until I'm back at Schatzalp, where I am the historian in residence for 3 months a year, and I could go back and wait, and then I would have the fascinating surroundings of an old, luxurious, private tuberculosis sanatorium right there in Davos. It's now a hotel, but it remains really historically intact. And I could simply wait until I have that wonderful place to record these videos and to show my viewers around. But I don't want to suspend it for that long. So I'm going to go ahead and push forward, and we're still on a chapter called Growing Anxiety, and it's sort of about Hans Castorp's search for a living mentor, or even just someone to model himself on, because in this chapter he also considers two very different grandfathers. So last time we had a look at Director Behrens, the head doctor of the Wald Sanatorium, who was someone whom Hans Castorp was consciously asking if he should consider a mentor and sort of model himself on in any way, and he decided against that. And he also rejected his cousin Joachim, who's only a little older than him and who's seriously ill and really is focusing all of his energies, his inner energies, on coping with the illness and hopefully achieving a cure. So the next person on the list is Herr Settembrini. But before we get to that, I want to introduce just a couple things. I have this old beat-up edition of Thomas Mann short stories, some, not all of them, Death in Venice and other stories. And I'm showing you the back cover because everything else is missing. It's always the case in my household, I'm afraid. There are so many of the books are either completely beat up and they've been read so many times that they're just falling apart, or they've been nibbled on by one of my Great Danes, who are perfectly capable of actually taking them off the bookshelves, even high up. And I don't know why they like to do that, but they do. My current one, he's not a puppy anymore, but he still is a menace to the books. But anyway, in this book, the translator of these short stories is a man called David Luke, and I don't think David Luke has done a translation of The Magic Mountain, which is a pity. But he talks about the person who was the sort of canonical translator of Thomas Mann's novels and works, and a woman named H.T. Lowe Porter, and she did work and get direct input from Thomas Mann, but apparently there were difficulties. So one of the first things David Luke does is go through, and you can see an example, and he goes story by story and shows the errors in the translation, the previous translation done by H.T. Lowe Porter. And it sounds a little mean, doesn't it? But I think, on the other hand, if you're not reading it in German and you really want a translation of high integrity, then it's worth knowing about, because it's not just that a word is wrong here or there, but sometimes something important, thematic, is changed. On the other hand, I continue to value H.T. Lowe Porter's works because of all the English language translators of Thomas Mann's works that I've ever come across. She is by far and away the most lyrical. And I think she captures some of what a great author will sort of intrinsically put in his work. And I wouldn't say that I think the other translators do to that extent. So the problem with her is not only that apparently she gets things wrong, like seriously wrong occasionally, but also that she wasn't enamored of Hans Castorp's, or not Hans Castorp, she wasn't enamored of Thomas Mann's eroticism. And so she tried to downplay that, or sometimes she would even take things out. So not great, not great. But if you have the time, then you would be well advised, I think, to read both her translation of The Magic Mountain and John Woods's translation of The Magic Mountain. Like I said, as far as I know, David Luke did not do a translation, but you're going to get the one that's very accurate and the one that's very lyrical. Okay, and one other thing before we start on Herr Settembrini, I want to, any of you who read German, and even if you don't read German well enough to read this very complex novel, The Magic Mountain, if you're like me and you can read simpler things, but not, great not literature at that level of writing, complex writing, then I would recommend the Davos Review. It's an old, venerable publication in Davos, stretching back into the sanatorium era. This is, let's see, this is a 2017 issue. I love the cover, and the theme of this issue is who came, who stayed, people visiting Davos, and it has such interesting essays and articles in it. And here's one, just for example, on the writer Poes. What was his first name? Llewellyn Poes. And he was an inmate at a sanatorium. I shouldn't say an inmate because they weren't inmates. They could go whenever they wanted. So let's say he was a guest or a patient at a sanatorium and he ended up dying in Davos. He was a British writer, not a novelist, but essayist and that sort of thing. Maybe he wrote novels. I don't know. I shouldn't say that. But he stayed at Sanatorium Clavadel during the sort of the period that is covered in The Magic Mountain. And anyway, you can find all kinds of treasures like that in the issues of the Davos Review. So anyone who's interested in Thomas Mann, in The Magic Mountain, in the sanatorium era, even the medical aspect of it, you'll find a wealth of wonderful things in the Davos Review, and I'm not getting any kickback from them. This is just a recommendation that I wanted to make. Here is the old sanatorium Schatzalp, now Hotel Schatzalp. And so if you're ever there in the late spring, early summer, up until about July, come up and see me. I'm always in residence there, and we can talk about the Magic Mountain, sanatoriums in general. And as you can see, it is in an absolutely gorgeous location. Okay, so let's talk about Herr Settembrini. Potential mentor number 2, and one who really does become Hans Castorp's primary mentor. And we're told in this part of the chapter, in Hans Castorp's assessment of Settembrini, he's thinking, apparently, or the narrator says, apparently he, Settembrini, wanted to exert some influence, and young Hans Castorp craved to be influenced. So, but Hans Castorp is of two minds about Herr Settembrini. So if you've been following these along, you know that Herr Settembrini is a relatively young Italian man. He's about 35 when the novel starts, but kind of an old spirit, an old soul, I guess is the way you say that. And Hans Castorp begins by thinking, well, he's three things. He's a naysayer and a windbag, and he's also a homo humanus. I don't know where the stress is on that in Latin. But unlike the naysayer and windbag descriptions, Homo humanus is what he calls himself, which I believe, when I looked it up when I looked up to get a translation of the Latin, it wasn't all that helpful. You could say he was a mensch, he was a human being, but I think what the context is saying is that he's a humanist. He definitely is a humanist, and he's an idealist and a humanist. And he's really trying to impart those ideas to Hans Castorp, but it kind of bugs Hans Castorp. So hence where you get this naysayer and windbag. And Hans Castorp also thinks of him as an organ grinder, which is, of course, insulting because he's definitely a gentleman and he's an intellectual. And Hans Castorp also says that he is in the way. So other assessments that Hans Castorp makes, Herr Settembrini is rebellious and critical, but also sentimental and bombastic. So if you could compare his personality to the range of a singer, then, it covers a lot of ground. So that intrigues Hans Castorp. Rebellious and critical on the one side, sentimental and bombastic on the other. And why is Hans Castorp attaching these negative words and adjectives to this man that he clearly is very much drawn to and clearly likes very much? Well, because of this greatly irritating thing that Herr Settembrini does, which is to tell him, you must leave now. You must leave the sanatorium now. And he sees what Hans Castorp doesn't want to see. That for someone with a fairly passive, dreamy kind of personality like Hans Castorp, he's just going to be sucked into this. And he's never going to leave. And he's already romanticizing death and that sort of thing. And so Settembrini is very serious about warning him, pack your bags and leave today. And Hans Castorp just doesn't appreciate that. That's where the bombastic part of it comes in. So what Settembrini is not, and this is my assessment, he is not a prosaic person. He is not fatalistic. He's not pragmatic. He likes the idea of the humanist idea of the practical value of work and technology, but he himself is too much of an idealist to be pragmatic, and he certainly is not fatalistic. Fatalism would be the exact opposite of what Herr Settembrini considers to be what's good and what's virtuous and what's right in life. And he equates fatalism with the East, mysticism, fatalism, and he sees that tendency too strongly in Hans Castorp. And my assessment is that above all else, the most important thing about Herr Settembrini is that he is fully aware. He sees all the dynamics that are going on. He understands them like a psychologist would, and like a person with that critical eye, and nobody else quite manages it. Behrens has his identity tied up with his work at the sanatorium, the doctor, and Joachim has his identity tied up with being a soldier and fighting this idea, this disease, and only Settembrini really has that level of awareness. And I did another video this week on Moby Dick, talking about characters and why Ishmael, the narrator of the novel, as opposed to other characters, is the only one who survives. And I would tie that in with the idea that Ishmael is the only one who's fully aware. There are other people who get little bits and pieces of the picture, but Ishmael sees the whole thing. He sees whenever there's some kind of trespass against the gods, so to speak. When somebody, in this case, Ahab with his pursuit of vengeance, when somebody is trying to steal fire from the gods. And Herr Settembrini is the one who sees all of these currents at the sanatorium. And that's certainly what makes him the most ideal mentor for Hans Castorp, because he brings out the awareness in Hans Castorp. And he's already playing this pedagogical role. He appears, we're told that he appears in several of Hans Castorp's dreams, and in these dreams he always has a mocking smile. He's always a mocker because he knows this young man is capable of seeing what's going on. Okay. And here's another issue with or another interesting thing, not an issue with Herr Settembrini, is that so when Castorp talks about him being critical, certainly we understand that, but what about rebellious? Well, he does things his own way. He's not going to be seduced into this regime, this regimen at the sanatorium. And one of the things that he does that goes against the norm is that he floats or drifts from table to table in the dining room. The dining room has 7 tables, each of which has places for 10 patients, and you're assigned your place at a table, and you're supposed to stay there. But Settembrini will get up. He does have his assigned place, and he will eat his food there, but then he'll get up and he'll sort of float from table to table and engage with people, and that very much is against the norm, although nobody tells him he can't do that. Nobody overtly objects to it. And it's through this habit of Herr Settembrini floating from table to table that we first sort of get an inkling of another one of the themes of the novel about Europe and the state of things in Europe at that time. As the novel begins, it's 1907, and one of the reasons that Settembrini gets up early from his table is because there's this man who's sort of his bête noire, who sits across from him, Herr Magnus, a brewer from someplace in Germany, I can't remember where. He's there with his sick wife, and he's living there with her, which did actually happen quite a lot, that the sick spouse would be joined by a healthy spouse who would just live there with them. Not something that was smiled upon later, when you're getting more towards the 40s, and they're taking they're taking this idea that it's a highly infectious disease more seriously. They knew that back in 1907, but they don't seem to have taken it particularly seriously. So anyway, Herr Magnus is very nationalistic, and he very much likes the fact that Germany is an autocratic state. And on this particular evening in the chapter, Herr Settembrini gets up in disgust and tells Hans Castorp that Herr Magnus has been giving him a lecture on ethnic psychology. And of course, being a German nationalist, he thinks the Germans are the best. And he says that he doesn't mind that he acknowledges, but doesn't mind that Germany is at this time what he calls a barracks. Because that barracks has been built on sturdy honesty and not corruption. And that could be kind of a dig at Herr Settembrini coming from Italy, where, any southern country, I don't want to sound like, that I myself am some holier than thou Anglo-Saxon, but it's a different, it's just a different way of doing things. And our friend Herr Magnus does not approve of it. Okay, so should I stop there? We haven't gotten very far. Oh, maybe I'll go on a little. The other thing that Herr Settembrini seems to delight in doing, which doesn't fit in with his humanistic ideals, but it does fit in with his search for the absurd and the ironic. preferably both together, and to enjoy himself. What he likes to do is spread gossip. Not in a malicious way, but the kind of thing that makes people laugh and makes it welcome when he drops by their table. So in this chapter, one of the things that he mentions is that there's this woman sitting at Hans Castorp's table named Frau Stur, and she's this sort of horribly vulgar woman and annoying. And Herr Settembrini notes that every evening the light is on her balcony, which is as it should be, because she should be out during her rest cure between 9:30 and 10 o'clock in the evening. And but what Herr Settembrini can add to that is that sometimes when the light is on in her balcony, it's a sham. She puts it on so that she can slip away and go down to Davos. And in fact, she was recently seen at the cinema in Davos with a patient from Romania, a Captain Miklosic from Bucharest. And there was a cinema then at that time in 1907, apparently. Wow, that's really early on for cinema. But there was a cinema there in the arcade of the Kurhaus. So any of you who are thinking of a trip to Davos or who are there at the moment and aren't familiar with Davos, you can go to the Kurhaus. It's not the Kurhaus anymore. It's now the Hotel Europe. But that was the Kurhaus. And across the street from it, you still have the arcade, and you still have a cinema at the arcade. And if you look at pictures of old Davos, and then you look at pictures of the arcade then, and you compare them to what the arcade looks like now, you'll see that it is very much the same. And I always enjoy that because, yeah, it's like a piece of history that's been preserved there. All right, there were lots of patients from Romania in those early pre-World War I years. There were, of course, also patients from Romania thereafter, but for whatever reason, the numbers were more, at least at Schatzalp. I go over the guest lists, the published guest list for Schatzalp for that time period. I've gone up to 1914 now, and yes, you would have, if you'd been staying at Schatzalp or at Wald Sanatorium, I'm sure you would have met guests from Romania, from Bucharest, from all over Eastern Europe. And then the other bit of gossip that he spreads is, he says, someone was snatched away by the devil, or to be more accurate, his mother, in Baco, etc. So he's talking about one of the adolescents who's at the sanatorium, and this boy who's just having a great time at the sanatorium because he doesn't have to go to school, he doesn't have to he doesn't have his parents breathing down his neck, and he's just having a grand time. And his mother, the devil, shows up and drags him away. And according to Herr Settembrini, she says if he's going to the dogs, he can just as well do it down below. So yeah, I mean, a lot of the patients who were at the sanatoriums could have just as well done what they were doing down below, as long as they had the ability to be in an environment where they could rest and get fresh air and not be under stress. You could do it down below, but it was definitely more therapeutic to be up at the sanatorium itself in the mountain air and with real peace and quiet and a real remove from your activities down below. But yeah, some people they didn't need it. And this boy was one of them. He probably wasn't. He probably didn't even really have TB. His parents had just had a bit of a scare. And so sent him up there. And speaking of dogs, going to the dogs, but speaking of real dogs, Settembrini also notes that there's a Greek patient who keeps a little dog in her room, and he tells a funny story about how the little dog had accidentally stepped or lay down on the emergency button to summon a nurse. And I find that interesting about the dog because Dmitri, absolutely, Grand Duke Dmitri, I should add, was a real life patient at Sanatorium Schatzalp from 1939 to 1942. And he was a great lover of dogs. And he had to give his little dog away. Before he went to the sanatorium, he had a little Cocker Spaniel named Sugar, and he had to give poor little Sugar away. Sugar actually ended up in the United States, of all places, with the person that Dmitri had given him away to. But obviously, by that time, we're no longer in 1907. Obviously, by 1939, it was no longer allowed to keep a dog in a TB sanatorium, even a luxurious one that was run partly like a grand hotel, or at least there was the illusion that it was a grand hotel. So if you go to Schatzalp, if you're in Davos and you either decide to stay at or to visit Schatzalp, you will not find dogs, but you will find cats. We have 4 house cats. So there's the old lady, Bella, and she is jet black. And then we have siblings, Johnny and Jeannie. And then we have Jeannie's daughter, Dimitra, who, of course, is my favorite because she's named after Grand Duke Dmitri, and they are really delightful creatures. So even if you're not gonna stay at Schatzalp, come up and say hello to the Schatzalp cats. All right. So a last little thing. Now we also get the news that, and I quote, beginning in autumn, no one with a temperature of 101.3 degrees would be admitted. So what is that in Celsius? Around 40? Something like that, I guess. I don't know. But why would a medical establishment, why would a tuberculosis sanatorium where everybody has a fever, why would they say if you have a fever of 101.3, you will no longer be admitted? They're not going to kick anybody out, obviously, who has fevers that high or higher, but they're not going to take any more patients that have a fever that high on a regular basis, on a daily basis. And, there were a number of reasons for that. One of the biggest was that simply from a business perspective, you could not have your sanatorium associated with a high death rate. People would go off, they would choose other sanatoriums that did not have a high death rate. And so that was important. And so they wanted people who it was still possible to treat. And if a person had really advanced tuberculosis, even with the mountain air and all the therapeutic things that you had there was just really nothing you could do for them at that time, especially in the Magic Mountain period in 1907. There were some procedures, but it was to some extent going to be a waste of money for them. And they'd probably be more comfortable at home with their families than being up at the sanatorium and ultimately dying there. And they had a full nursing staff, but I don't know if most of the sanatoriums, it wasn't ideal to have to provide what we would now call intensive care with round-the-clock nursing. And, so that was another thing. Sometimes patients were sent from the sanatoriums to hospitals if they needed really intensive care like that. So all of the sanatoriums, too, not all of the sanatoriums. Why did I say that? All of the public sanatoriums that I've read about, and there are a lot more memoirs and diaries that were written by people who were in public sanatoriums or charity sanatoriums than people who were in private sanatoriums. And all of the public sanatoriums, every one of them had a room that was designated as the room that you took people to who were within, 1 or 2 days of dying. And so these rooms were absolutely dreaded. obviously by the rest of the patients. If you went into that room, you usually did not come out of that room alive. Sometimes that wasn't the case. Sometimes it happened. But the reason you had those in public sanatoriums is you didn't usually have private rooms in public sanatorium. And so the patients were on a ward, with as few as two people, 2 or 4 people, or in a real ward with, lots of people. And so it was too distressing for the other patients, and it was probably too distressing for the dying person as well. And so they would move them to this designated room. And I don't believe they had that at Schatzalp or at any of the other private sanatoriums in Davos, because people did have private rooms. I mean, maybe there was some form of that near the nurses station or in the medical wing or something like that, but I've never heard about it anyway. All right, so now concluding with a little bit about Grand Duke Dimitri's experience. He was a patient that was very lucky to have been admitted, because he was pretty far gone when he first arrived. Not only did he have tuberculosis, but he actually, if you can imagine, had gangrene in his lung. At least that was what he was diagnosed with at Schatzalp, and they gave him creosote, if you can imagine, which is used to treat railroad ties. And they were astounded when he actually sort of turned a corner and started to recover. He was a tough old bird. He wasn't that old at that time. He was in his 40s, but he was a lifelong smoker going back to adolescence. And so anyway, he was damn lucky that they let him into the sanatorium, because he would have died if he'd just stayed in a hotel. And they didn't usually take people in that condition. So it could be that was one of the benefits of being a Grand Duke. I don't know, but they did let him in. And then from the winter of 1940 until March of 1941, he had 2 botched surgeries, and he became very, very, very close to death. Almost bled out on the operating table, and he was fully conscious that was happening. He hadn't been put under. So he had this horribly, just harrowing experience. And, they didn't send him to a hospital. They didn't send him to a hospice, which is another thing they did. He did ultimately die there in 1942, but he died having been given his discharge, having been told, you're well enough to leave now. He died of kidney failure, which the doctor should have caught early enough to do something about it, or the doctor may have caught it. The doctor, Dr. Maurer, had a habit that Dimitri knew about of not giving people dire news about their health, of trying to cover it up and saying, oh, you're doing great, you're getting better, don't worry. So maybe Dr. Maurer knew about it and thought, well, there's just nothing that can be done about it. And said, go on home, or wherever it is you want to go. He probably would have just gone to a hotel, because he didn't have a family with him in Europe, and it was the middle of World War II. But anyway, that was his experience, unfortunately. And I don't know. That's something I need to look into, about what were the criteria for when they would send a patient away, or for what patients they wouldn't admit at all. So I want to end this with a quote from a Thomas Mann short story called, in English, The Joker, also sometimes translated as The Clown. And I've been rereading these early Thomas Mann short stories, that all of which were written before the Magic Mountain, and this one almost 30 years before the Magic Mountain. But you can see the themes that Thomas Mann was starting to develop that would make their way into Magic Mountain. And this one is particularly apt for this chapter. All right. One might suppose that a man's inner experience becomes all the more violent and disturbing the more undisturbed and uncommitted and detached from the world his outward life is. And I think that applies very well to Hans Castorp because he really doesn't know who he is. He really doesn't make an attempt to find out who he is as a human being. As a young man in his early 20s, he just sort of goes with the flow until he comes to the sanatorium. And then all of a sudden, all of these sides of Hans Castorp that nobody knew were there, least of all Hans Castorp, are coming out because of these inner conflicts he's having. And so I think Thomas Mann is quite right about that, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if that wasn't something that happened, maybe not with the majority of sanatorium patients, but for the ones that had, the right personality and the capacity for introspection, that this new and unique and sort of world of its own kind of environment in a sanatorium would bring out the any unresolved issues in a person's interior life. I've talked about that before, but I was excited when I found that quote from the Joker. So yeah, I hope I get more than one view this time, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.